So now we move on to the whole jobs thing. Okay, I'm going to spend a little bit of time in here because I know it's an issue that's perking in interest, especially in Wisconsin right now. But the work spectrum. Right there you have, the half oval. And just like we have an autism spectrum, where on one end of the spectrum might be Albert Einstein, and on the other end might be that significantly challenged individual we're talking about, okay? Here, we're going to do a different type of spectrum. We're going to do a spectrum of, on one end, what is, here comes that 50-cent word again. What is the most behaviorally pluralistic work environment that you could find yourself in? In other words, where is it okay to be the weird guy? And then we'll put that on this end. And then on the other bottom end, we're going to put, on this end, we're going to put, where is the least behaviorally pluralistic work environment that you could possibly find yourself in? So, if I can see you, let me hear a guess. What do you think the most behaviorally pluralistic work environment might be? Where you can be the weird guy. The where? The circus? I love that. That's a great one. I'm sorry, what was the other one? A comedian. You're both in there. It's basically the arts and university life, okay? So, Professor Johnson yelled at you? Oh, that's okay. He's a genius, And the arts, the rock group, that trashes their hotel room, eccentricity is king in the arts. So, of course, that's the most behaviorally pluralistic environment you can work in. What do people think is the least behaviorally pluralistic? Military. Right on, sister. Thank you, neighbor. Usually people struggle. You hear Wall Street, bankers, politicians, blah, 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 before somebody gets to the military. Absolutely. But here's the funny thing. The military is just as attractive a life for an individual on the spectrum. Because for those of us who can't read between the lines and who need things explained to us about how the world works, they're going to tell you how to behave from the moment you wake up in the morning until the moment of lights out at night in the military. And that is heaven for many individuals on the autism spectrum. Okay, not to own a big, can of worms about lots of people on the spectrum in the military, but, what am I going to do? Unfortunately, it's the 9-to-5 office job where 85 to 90% of our folks end up having to go. And this is a problem because in these areas, the social rules are never communicated, and they're different in each particular location. And you have to understand, too, that in these environments, we are exposed for constantly telling a lie to our kids. And that is that if you're good at what you do, you'll be fine and you'll have a job. But if the job skills lie in that 85 to 90%, 9-to-5 office type thing, it's a lie. It's a total lie. Your job is usually very, very much replicable, which means that anybody can do your job. And that a very high premium on whether or not you stay in that job is going to be dependent on how you socially fit in. I wanted to share with you a couple of slides of some of the stuff that I tried to train human resource professionals on. Especially there was I don't talk about it as much because I was only there for 3 years or so, but I was the founding executive director of an organization called ASTEP. And what we did was we took some recent college grads. Adults on the spectrum have an 80 to 85% unemployment rate. And now we're getting a lot of really, really good press about what we're capable of. And obviously, we can point to Silicon Valley and say, we built that town. So, there's some ability here, just so long as, the environment is able to bring that out of an individual. And some of the things that we start to look at when we look at diversity and inclusion departments, for instance, in corporations and in large corporations. Well, first off, they're really supposed to be focusing on 6 areas or 7 areas. They're supposed to be looking on race, they're supposed to look at gender, sexual orientation, disabilities, and veterans. And unfortunately, 95% of them are still stuck on race and gender. Many of them have been dragged kicking and screaming into sexual orientation. And veterans is one that really has people thrown for a loop because they want to do the right thing and they want to bring in veterans. But the struggles and the challenges that veterans present them in terms of post-traumatic stress disorder every once in a while has them in a bind. And unfortunately, what really just needs to happen is those corporations need to spend the money to teach people about how to manage post-traumatic stress disorder, and those vets would get jobs, but nobody wants to spend that money. Disabilities, however, really confuses people, okay? And it confuses people actually for a very legitimate reason. Within a large corporation, you will have what's called an employee resource group, which is actually just a big support group. And let's say that there's an employee resource group for the Asian American women that work at that corporation. And this is great. And once a week or once a month, the Asian American women can get together and talk about things they just wouldn't be able to talk about with anybody else, and have that sense of shared experience so that they're not the only person in the world that is going through something, okay? And for any marginalized group. You have to remember too that, when we make correlations to all these other elements of diversity and inclusion, it really just has to do with the context of majority versus minority, okay? We always think of these in sociological terms, okay? But really at their heart, they are math terms. And what's important to understand about this is that if you're part of a majority, any kind of a majority, that it is inevitable that you are going to think that your way of doing things is the right way of doing things, even if it sucks, okay? Because you're part of the majority. You have that sense of public, yay, your way is the right way. Whereas if you are part of any marginalized community or any minority, you are always going to be thinking that your way of doing things has something wrong to it. You are always going to be prone to more self-doubt, even if your way of doing things is brilliant. That's just how majorities and minorities work at work. So now we have that established as we move forward. How do we define disability? And if you're in that employee resource group for people with disabilities, let's say you got two people in a wheelchair. You've got somebody who's not a veteran who has post-traumatic stress disorder, and you've got somebody with Asperger's syndrome. You've got somebody who's going through chemotherapy because they have cancer, okay, which is a legitimate disability. How much do those people have in common? Not a lot. Not a lot. And that's why corporations freak sometimes when it comes to accommodating people with disabilities. So we define disability and we can break it down even more, okay? Through visible disabilities by physical or sensory, physical being mobility limitations, sensory being hearing and vision, and hidden versus or non-apparent disabilities, which is things like mental health, depression and anxiety, physical health, diabetes and epilepsy, learning disabilities such as dyslexia and ADD, and developmental disabilities such as autism spectrum disorders. Some of the hidden disabilities, here's a list of others that fall under this particular category, things like cancer, things like agoraphobia, things like depression, chronic fatigue syndrome. Some of them surprise you, some of them don't. Glaucoma. And just, to throw some stats at you, about hidden disabilities and how prevalent they are in our world. 3 to 5% of the current and potential workforce has ADD or ADHD. Nearly 10% of the current and potential workforce has a learning disability. About 1 in 5 adults has a diagnosable psychiatric disability in any given year. That's a wow. 1 in 48 individuals on the autism spectrum, we already know that. And depression is now the second leading cause of absence from the workplace. And if you're wondering what's the first, it's stress. Now, if you're one of those corporations that's wondering about some of your employees, okay, possible signs might be things like trouble paying attention, asking to have information repeated regularly, difficulty following directions, confused, sudden mood changes, anxiety, sensory issues, extreme fatigue. Do I have one more? Yes. Persistent lateness, okay? Now, all these things, usually we've felt very, very justified of saying, that guy's a screw up. Pretty much to everything on there. So society is changing, and society is changing for a good way. Because possible strengths that might come from a lot of this stuff, especially from non-apparent disabilities, might be an accuracy and attention to detail, high level of technical ability, a good concentration on routines and procedures, a good memory for facts and figures, a logical approach to tasks, honesty, and loyalty. We're very loyal. Some of the global statistics about stuff like this. I'm just throwing stats at you here like a stat monster here, but it's good to overwhelm you in this capacity. 1 in 6 people globally, okay, has a disability. And that's up from 1 in 10 in the 1970s. 386 million people with disabilities are of working age. Lower income countries have a higher prevalence of disability than higher income countries. And this is amazing because there's another bullet point that's going to come up that actually kind of contradicts that. It might be right here. Here we go. No, it's a later bullet. Only 45 countries have anti-discriminatory or other disability-specific laws. Reliable data in only 36 countries, okay? Now, what's amazing to me about that third bullet is that in order to document disability, you got to have some money to do the study, right? Okay, and that only usually comes from economically solvent nations. So the fact that you do have lower income countries having or showing a higher prevalence of disability than higher income countries is actually kind of amazing. How do we define these hidden disabilities? We do it again, culture by culture, which we've been talking about. Many hidden disabilities are defined by differing behaviors. But what is a differing behavior can vary wildly. And obviously I'm realizing I've already jumped to this slide earlier on. So the importance placed on socialization can also differ from culture to culture. Yeah, we know that. 3 types of non-apparent disability colleagues and students or acquaintances, okay? And this is good to keep in mind, especially if you're in any kind of a supervisory position. That is that you have somebody that might be undiagnosed. In other words, they don't know either that they have this condition. They might be diagnosed and undisclosed. They don't trust you with this personal information, which most probably shouldn't, but yet they are diagnosed. And then you have diagnosed and disclosed. And oddly enough, we've done a massive turnaround in terms of our attitudes about if you're, the head of that company, do you want people telling you this stuff? Are we back in the days of don't ask, don't tell? No, we're not. We're actually in the exact opposite now. People want to be able to show good diversity and inclusion numbers to their shareholders now, okay? Very different environment. Number 1, because it's politically correct and because there's a lot of public pressure, yes. But number 2, because all studies show that no matter what area we're talking about, the more diverse a business is of any kind, the more they will actually outperform their peers. It is a recipe for success that seems to be working on all levels, especially, at least in major corporations. Yes, here we go. Why do businesses want non-apparent disability employees to disclose? Also, the cost of accommodation is something that really, scares a lot of people away from hiring people with disabilities in these corporations. But the cost of accommodation is negligible. Employers estimate that workplace accommodations cost on average less than $500 for an employee with a disability. That's it. Diversity is good for business. I just went over this. Companies that are more diverse have been proven to outperform their peers. And yes, if an employee knows or an employer knows that an individual has a particular disability, and let's say it's causing challenges in the workplace, then they have somebody to work with. They can have a conversation about this. Now, the secret to addressing 90% of the challenges, and this actually, let's get this out of the Fortune 500 companies and into schools, and into families, and into everything, okay? Has to do with 3 main components. And this is really, really brilliant stuff. This is brain surgery. I don't know if I'm going to be able to get this across to you. Okay? Honestly, one of the things that I tell, if I'm telling these corporations sometimes, or I'm telling anybody, knock it off with the euphemisms, knock it off with the soliloquies, knock it off with the sarcasms, knock it off. Midwest, I'll be honest, okay? You guys, like when I first got here, I was like, they don't communicate. They don't. They don't use words. They use tone. And well, actually, no, that was the second stage. I suddenly realized, no, they do communicate, but they communicate more through tone than they do through language. They're like the Chinese, The mom, when she says goodbye to the daughter that brings the new boyfriend home for Thanksgiving, in that goodbye, she can actually communicate to her daughter, have some self-respect. He's scum. Don't you dare bring his ass across that threshold again. Or in that same goodbye, she can communicate, get a ring, get a ring, get a ring, get a ring. Okay? You Midwesterners are amazing in that capacity. I'm still learning your language, though. But I still contend that if I can get you to use your words and be blunt, maybe not as blunt as New Yorkers, okay, I get it. But if I can get people to use their words with one another, forget about the autism spectrum. We're getting people to communicate better with each other outside of the autism spectrum when we get people to use their words better, as opposed to expecting, oh, that person should have understood that, or this person should have had that. I will actually confess something else to you. That when I was running GRASP, we had some free time on our hands, and we decided, you know what? We've got all these groups all across the country now, all across North America. Let's do a study. Let's figure out, just on our own, let's figure out where in this country is the best place for an autism spectrum individual to live, and where's the worst place. And we divided into categories, like services, we divided into, like, we had two categorizations, one for, more challenged autism, others for, better ability to mirror greater society autism. And we looked at all these parameters. And I'm going to make a confession to you. Believe it or not, despite the educational improvements of, let's say, the Southeast or, some other places, and the fact that at the time there was still an economy in the Midwest, which I think has evaporated significantly since then, we found the Midwest to be the worst place to live for those individuals who had a higher ability to mirror greater society. And the reason is that on a cultural level, there is this iconography of the stand-up Midwestern guy and the stand-up Midwestern gal, which is very noble. And I'm here because I married a Green Bay girl, and we're here to take care of her parents a little bit. And I promise you, I benefit from that stand-up Midwestern iconography. I got a great wife, okay? You guys create great wives, honestly. I tell all my friends, get a Midwestern wife. But when it comes to behavioral pluralism, okay, if somebody is outside that stand-up Midwestern guy or gal iconography, they are looked down upon. They are not given the right to have different, behavioral systems. It's harder here. It's much, much harder here. And I think also that while there's some noble, I'm just going to treat you like you're anybody else, you can't just do it as a blanket cowboy statement. And I think that sometimes, especially in the schools, that still exists around here. The cowboy culture has its merits, but we can't go too far with it necessarily. And think of my poor mother-in-law, okay? Margie, all right? Let me tell you what Margie went through in all those years when we were living in New York. I'd be going off to plural speaking gigs in Minnesota, plural in Illinois, plural in Michigan. And she's sitting here in Green Bay, and she's going, Michael, when are you going to speak in Green Bay? Now, of course, she's sitting at her home because she's got stuff to do. She didn't come today. But she is going to listen to Wisconsin Public Radio, which I have to Zoom out of here. They're doing a thing in concurrent with the speaking gig, and I have to go rush at 4 o'clock off to that. But poor Margie, she wanted to come see her son-in-law, and but Wisconsin wouldn't hire me. And so, of course, we choose to live here. No diagnosis is the bad guy, okay? If you need bad guys, if you need targets to go after things like anxiety, anger, and depression. Those are your bad guys. Those are the things that are going to make an individual's life so much harder. It's not any diagnosis. And for us, also distrust. There's a wonderful guy named Barry Prezant who just recently wrote what I think is the first time I've ever said it's a must-read for educators and parents. And it's a book called Uniquely Human. And a long time ago, though, he and I wrote an article together called The Primacy of Trust. And my contribution to the article was really just about the fact that from all my work, I was starting to realize that the opposite of anxiety wasn't calm. Because calm is really an absence. It can't really be an opposite of anything. To me, the opposite of anxiety was trust. And trust is a big issue. And too often we associate or we automatically lump in trust with love. And they don't work that way. Look at families, okay? We have lots of relatives that we do love with all our hearts, but that we will never trust. The screw-up cousin or whoever it might be. And we might have those, a-hole college professors that yell at us that we will trust because we know that they're brilliant and they get us and we can learn from them and we will trust them. We will never love them. Okay, we will never love them. And it's very funny because like Margie and I sometimes have these crazy conversations about Midwestern nice, and how I just can't seem to fall in line with it. And I always talk, but Margie, nice isn't the same as good, There's you go ask, Jewish people that lived in Poland in the 1930s about how nice their neighbors were, and then, until the Nazis came to town, and then they, and she's like, oh, Michael, stop, But I also can contend that, I was very lucky when I was, doing all that foreign work, and was a minor league diplomat because I actually got to hang out with a Nobel Peace Prize winner and a Nobel Peace Prize nominee. And in both of those instances of people that clearly do good in their lives, that I'll confess that they were unbearable people to hang around. They were not nice. They were not nice at all. So nice has its merits. Margie and I can always agree on that. But the whole notion of trust is very difficult because sometimes if you're a smart kid on the spectrum, you may find that if somebody has proven to you that they do not get you, that you'd be stupid to trust them. And this is very hard sometimes. And that what you're always, I think, working to if you're a caregiver or a teacher is to demonstrate, not just how nice you and how willing you are to do whatever you can for them, but to demonstrate that you actually get them. Because that's what's going to get you the biggest results with that kid, is if you can show that you understand what their motivations are, what their thinking is like sometimes. That's what's going to get a kid to be able to do the things that you ask him to, or be brave and try that new strategy out. The best description of all this stuff that I've ever heard before in my life actually came from a 5-year-old child. The child had this great relationship with their pediatrician. They could kind of bust each other's chops a little bit. And the doctor once, was just joking around with his 5-year-old kid. His name was Dylan. And he said, I know what's going on with you. You've just got too many wires. And the kid said, no, doctor, my problem is that the wires aren't insulated well enough. It revolves around things like failure, okay? And our inability to interpret failure. And, with all this crunchy granola PC stuff that I'm throwing at you, please understand that I'm also bemoaning the loss of quote-unquote developmentally appropriate experiences that teach kids on the spectrum, or any kids with special needs, that they have to experience failure the same amount as you do if they're going to be able to process and come to the same terms and have that thick skin towards failure that everybody else has. Because we all need that thick skin about failure. And the more times that we are allowed to fail, obviously, the more we realize, wow, failing isn't going to kill me. So that we get up off the mat quicker. And that's how we develop, and that's how we learn, and that's how we get better. And we need more of those developmentally appropriate places. It may not be mirror image experiences that other kids have, but we need those developmentally appropriate places where we can fail just as much as anybody else, so that we learn how to process failure. Because if we're not given that opportunity and we're only allowed, once a year to fail, and we do fail, that failure is going to feel a lot worse than if we were given the opportunity to fail every single day. The biggest obstacle is that no one wants to please more than us. And wants to please, again, glass half empty, glass half full stuff, will always be can't handle rejection to others. There are two wonderful words that at one point, early on in GRASP's development in that support group, I was just noticing that there was just something going on with the group, and I suddenly realized, holy cow, all these guys, they've all been raised because everybody, their caregivers, were so loving and were so scared for all these horrible things that could happen to them, being sexually assaulted, going to jail for stalking, getting fooled and duped by schemes and pranks and all this sort of jazz. That, they were always supervised by these fearful caregivers saying, this is important, this is important, this is important, this is important, you have to do this, you have to do this. Who were just freaking out over all the horror stories that they could imagine in their minds, okay? And that they had not been raised enough with the same sort of logic that a lot of you were probably raised with was, oh, this isn't important, don't worry about that. Oh, that person doesn't like you? Who cares? Who cares? That person's a dick. Don't worry, who cares? Nobody likes everybody, that's not to be expected. So I didn't exercise with the group. I wanted them just to verbalize, speak, 2 very simple words, because I was curious as to whether they'd ever said it before in their lives. First word was so. What do you think the second word was? So what? That person doesn't like me. So what? Oh, I guess I wasn't nice in that experience, was I? So what? Who cares? And they giggled. And they giggled because it felt weird, and it felt liberating, and it felt kind of good in a ticklish sort of way. It was an amazing experience. Amazing experience. Because life always is going to throw you some punches, okay? Temple is a good buddy. She and I also just recently wrote an article on how we would love to see things like carpentry and plumbing and electrician training entered into the high school curriculums of kids on the spectrum. We will out-earn everybody else that's going to school for English and political science, okay? Promise you. I promise you that. In my day, it was just the poetry and the philosophy majors, and now it's English, political history, it's history, it's science, it's crazy. But Temple Grandin also knows that I say this about her. And I don't think Temple Grandin is special because of the books she wrote. I don't think Temple Grandin is special because of her work in the cattle field. I think Temple Grandin is special and enormously iconic in our world, because if you ever get a chance to hear Temple Grandin speak, ask her about what it was like to be the only woman working on a Colorado cattle ranch in the 1960s and the crap she took. Temple Grandin is tough as nails, okay? And that is important. I do believe in that. Not just physically tough, but mentally tough. She does let the small stuff roll off her back, and that's incredibly important to all of us. And she's very special in that category. So, some perspective. We're kind of talking about our makeup in one specific area here, because there's a lot of different elements that make a human being into a human being. And the one that we're talking about here today is that one right there, neurological makeup. Okay? But there's 2 more. There's quality of supports, and there's culture. For those that can't read, the bullet points are thus: gender, race, economic background, sexual orientation, neurological makeup, quality of supports, and culture. What I will say, though, is that one of these bullet points is infinitely more important than any of the others. Whatever's in second place isn't even close. What do you think the most important bullet point up there is? Quality of supports. That's right. If you're raised to feel good about who you are, no matter who you are, you've got a shot. It's pretty easy. And if you're not raised to feel good about who you are, no matter who you are, you're going to have a much, much harder time. That's my moment of shameless self-promotion. Those are the 2 books. Oddly enough, the one to the right comes out tomorrow. So, if any of you would like PDFs of this presentation, it's really funny because when people say, oh, are you going to have handouts? And it's a giant pain in the butt to do handouts. You got to print them out for everybody and stuff like that. And it's so much easier to say, oh, no, I'm green. PDFs. So I just basically get to click a button. So I have a PDF of this presentation at the ready on my hard drive right down there. And if any of you want to have that PDF of this presentation, please, by all means, just feel free to email me. That's also the Shamelessly Self-Promotional website, if anybody's interested in that. And I'm going to give you a little bit of perspective. If any of you have read my first book, you're going to know who said this quote, so please shush. It's not fair to the others. I'd like to see if anybody can guess who said this. So if here we are on the Canadian border, and if we're worried about the Mexican border, let's think about this quote for a second. Okay. Security is a superstition. It does not exist in nature. Life is either a daring adventure or nothing. Who said that? I am not a Freud guy. Freud did lots of weird things. His theories have all been proven wrong. He slept with his patients. It's really hard to be a Freud guy. But Freud had one really, really brilliant thing to say, and that was that if you really want someone to change, then you have to change. Thank you all for listening. I really appreciate it. And we had to have the perfect amount of time for a Q&A. Video man, do I need to get the microphone to people asking questions, or do you just want me to repeat the question up here? Repeat the question, okay. If I can see anybody. Let me see. Yes, sir. I'm going to go front to back because how dare you sit so far away from me?
Well, first I'd just like to tell you who I am. My name is Rob, and my daughter is 23 now. She was diagnosed at age 3. She's a senior at the University of Notre Dame. She's a very high-functioning person, and I'm from one of the good planets, by the way. I went through a real metamorphosis with all of this about 7 years ago. I read an article by a young man. He said, "Stop trying to cure us," and it just hit me like a ton of bricks.
You just heard one kid saying this? There was 1,000 of us yelling at you. You didn't hear us? Holy cow.
And I know that Temple Grandin had said something very similar to that as well. And I've really taken it to heart. I don't want a cure for my daughter. She'd be a different person. She's a magnificent person in every way. And so,
Attaboy.
I understand that there are people whose child or loved one is lower on the spectrum, and they'd give anything for a cure. I understand that and get that. But for some of us, we don't want a cure. And then I just want you to comment, if you would, real quickly, as far as socialization. How do you feel about social media as a means of socialization? I'm a member of several Facebook groups of people that are on the spectrum that have allowed me into these groups because I've explained who I am, and I agree with a lot of what they have to say, and they're very interactive, and I think that's a very real form of socialization for them.
I agree with you. It is a very real form of socialization for them. It's different. It's different than what we grew up with, that's for sure. But none of us ever want to become those old people that say, well, because the kids don't do it the way I did it, in my day, the kids were all wrong. Then it's time to die. If we're not learning from our kids, there's something going on. I will say that I get annoyed at my kids at it, sometimes only because I moan the death of things like reading. I moan the death of things like my favorite filmmaker is a guy named Andrei Tarkovsky. I don't think he made one film that was less than 5 hours long, okay? And probably has maybe 3 pages of dialogue in the whole film. Okay, that's the sort of thing that I can never expect the young people, to appreciate sometimes. But that's just because they're changing and they're redefining their world for who they are. And of course, if you're on the autism spectrum, when you're talking about reciprocal conversation, I actually had a great gig. I was the backup classical music host in New York Public Radio for a lot of years, especially when Grasp was young. And I suddenly realized later on in my career that everybody likes radio who's on the autism spectrum because you can speak into the microphone and you don't have to, wait or worry about somebody else who's about to jump in and start talking. You can just go for as long as you want and then stop when you want. And the whole aspect of reciprocal conversation also exists with texting, with social media, where you don't have to, sort of do the banter and the timing issue when you have a conversation with somebody else. Also, it just allows you to express yourself in different ways. There are obviously also different challenges. There's, the increased risk for people to lie on social media. But didn't they lie in real life too? So you did remind me, though, of something. I skipped over a bullet, and I skipped over a very important bullet, that when we talk about individuals, who may be more challenged than individuals who might be more like Albert Einstein, okay, that too often This was on the Myths Dispelled page, that we've made this giant mistake as one end of the spectrum fought the other end of the spectrum, tried to invalidate the seriousness of the other's experiences. And part of the reason for that is really just that we've always mistakenly held the ability to communicate as the measuring stick for happiness. Okay? That if you can talk, you're happy. If you can't talk, you're not happy. And this is garbage. And we need to come up with another measuring stick for what makes a happy human life. Because I can tell you about, I did tell you about that nonverbal individual who might have a clean place to live and pretty colors to look at. And that person might be insanely happy. Whereas with one of our guys, tests an IQ chart, at 190, and is expected to be, the head of a Fortune 500 company, doesn't go anywhere because of the social stuff that nobody taught him, and falls on his face and becomes a total failure, maybe even a suicide statistic. So that whole happiness is, equal to, how well you can communicate. It's got to go. Next question. Yes?
Trying to get a child on the autism spectrum out of their comfort zone or out of their box. For instance, a child who does not like to be interactive in sports, but as a parent want them to be in a sport. What kind of resources or suggestions do you have of trying to push your child to their limits or push them so they can step outside the box and feel that and get that thick skin?
I'm the type of parent that actually doesn't mind taking away computer time or video game time as a means to coerce a kid to do what I want with them. I really don't. Everybody complains about video game time, and I'm just like, I'm sorry, but that's the best ammunition a parent has ever been given, okay, to take it away. It's awesome. I would say that obviously the first thing you're looking for, though, is what's the kid's interest? Is there any game that the kid has taken a look at? Even if it's, ultimate frisbee, something, along those lines. The one thing that I should probably put up a bullet, though, in that sports thing, that there is a massive difference between team sports and individual sports. Because in individual sports, if you fail, it's like you failed on a math test. No big deal, and you failed yourself. The whole peer ostracization potential, but also peer, community potential that exists on a team sport. That's something that's going to have its pros and cons, and that just may be, a good choice. So maybe, if you see that your kid is really socially anxious, but has a slight affinity for a tennis racket or a golf club, something like that, that's probably where I would start. Next question. Yes.
Right. So you were diagnosed as an adult,
Yes.
and most of us in this room work at the university, so predominantly working with adults, or either being diagnosed or have been diagnosed. What would you say are the skills that were new to you that you started focusing on after that diagnosis in your life that you've incorporated now?
Wow. I guess, it's the question for the camera, and I'm sorry I haven't been saying the questions for the camera yet. I forgot. Question for the camera is that what skills, since I was diagnosed, have I been focusing on? This comes from a woman who works at the university and who works with adults most of the time. I would say probably just being able to pay more attention to how I deal with people, and studying people as though they were different than I am, rather than that we're all the same big happy family. Oh, give me a hug. I think that, if we can acknowledge those differences in a way that doesn't, offend anybody, and sometimes that's inevitable, but that, if we study those and look to things like, give you a good example would be, I'm somebody that's traveled all over the world. I have stories. It's really hard to have better stories than I do. And that makes me the hated guy at the dinner table, okay? And it's hard, and I had to learn at one point, that when somebody tells their story, you're not supposed to tell the same story from that same genre of storytelling that will blow the socks off that other person's story and get them to hurt their feelings, okay? It just cognitively never, it was even a thought, for me to think, well, if, we can spare that individual's feelings and yet, the consequence and the sacrifice is not getting across, this amazing moment in your life, or something like that, then let's weigh the consequences in each situation because it might not be worth it. And I think that probably that has to, you're very focused on whether you're right or you're wrong until you learn. And then once you start learning about the fact that being right or wrong isn't actually the most important thing, that's really the biggest change I think that came about in my life. Yes, sir? Oh, not you? Oh, okay, I just saw the hand move. Yes? Yes, I have. The question is, have I seen the show The Bridge? What do I think of Sonya's character? It's not what I would call organic. They're applying very real and very true clinical bullet points to it. I wouldn't say that it's smooth to the point where, my Asperger version of gaydar goes off bells and whistles. Not like that. And I actually know the guy that's coaching her, actually on the show. I'm also not offended by it in any way. I think that actually, especially a lot of, the attention to the fact that she has a very cold and calculated sex life, and that, she's not, interested in, relationship structures such as monogamy necessarily, or close attachment, that she understands the medicinal aspects of sexuality, that's actually an area where we do need to discuss more, and where I'm actually grateful to the show. Because, it's that whole can you have love without sex and sex without love thing. And in the autism spectrum, I think that because of the pragmatics involved, that individuals do actually pursue lives more like that than others, might think. I mean, when I was doing work on the sex book, for instance, it was like I'd come across in Grasp many times individuals on the spectrum who worked as adult film actors and actresses. And it was just, look, I suck at relationships. I like sex. I can make a lot of money. And, I'm a monogamous, happily married guy, and I'm just kind of like, whoa! But, at the end of the day, when I really think about that, I'm just like, I can't argue with that. I can't. It's not right. So, good question, though. Mm-hmm. Anybody else? A lady up there? A lady up there, whoever you are. I still can't see your hand, but go ahead. Yellow. Oh, yes, you are in a weird shadow. I'm not ignoring you. Listen, lady. The sports ones haven't been outed yet. They're there. They're out there. I do go off bells and whistles when I see certain people on Pardon the Interruption. I promise you. Yes?
I just kind of had a question, for somebody who has Asperger's or something like me.
Yeah, man. Welcome, neighbor.
What is, I don't know, if you know him, what kind of advice might be good for trying to get a job or something like that, that maybe somebody that I wouldn't specifically have to date, but would I want to put something like I have Asperger's on my resume, or put that in an interview or something,
I would say that just judging you right now in terms of what's, coming across and whether or not your diagnosis is physically readable to me or what have you, I would say that you don't need to do that right now. I'd say that, the good thing for you might be, down the road, that if a problem starts to arise and you feel like maybe a situation might come up where you need legal protection, that's when you disclose. And two things, if that ever happens, and hopefully it doesn't, but if that does ever happen, you disclose in writing, never verbally. And you always disclose not just to your supervisor in writing, but his or her supervisor in writing. But that's the worst case scenario. I think that the general thought that folks like you and me need to understand, which took me a while, believe me, is that too often when we get into a workplace, our minds are just going, at 8 cylinders a second, and we're trying to figure out how that business works. And usually, sometimes we'll come up with even a fairly brilliant business idea as to how that business works that actually isn't true. And our ideas are logic. It doesn't mean their ideas are bad, but it's just based on the fact that we don't have all the information that other people have, that the idea isn't true. And very often what's really hard is that the boss's way of doing things is what's most important. And very often, like I've been that guy, believe me, where I thought my idea was 10 times better than the boss's way. Okay? Believe me, I've suffered from that. Okay? But if you want to keep the job, you got to listen and you got to pay attention to what the boss's way of doing things is. That's really the hardest lesson, I think, on the job. Stacy, how are we doing for time? Is it 4? I got to get to a radio station. All right. Thank you. Thank you all.